Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fourth day of the next summer school, and yet it moves. We need new education for new normality. We've already had 3 quite exciting days, and a lot of you have been following us since Monday. We started with very big topics of democracy, degrowth. Yesterday, we had an input from teachers' perspective and parents' perspective on the situation with the lockdown. I'm sorry. And then today we're moving to something completely different, I would say. And maybe we're going more concretely into our, let's say, everyday business, which at Network of Education Policy Centers, of course, is policy analysis and policy recommendations and research, etc. So for today, we have for you prepared, I'm very sorry, presentation on Toolkit for Applied Behavioral Insights, which has been done at OECD. And we have James Drummond with us, who is a policy analyst at OECD, who worked on this toolkit and who will present the toolkit to us. And then as a second presentation, we have from our membership, Ivona Čelabicic and Lamia Spahic from proMENTE Social Research from Bosnia and Herzegovina, who have recently used the methodology of behavioral insight in their research on gender differences in STEM field and connected very closely to education. Before we start, I just want to give you a few logistic information. While there is presentation, the best thing you can do is to keep your mic off. That way we don't have any background noise. After both presentations, we'll then open to the audience for questions. You can do it 2 ways. You can post your questions in the chat, and as a moderator, I will pass it on to our speakers to get the response. Or if you would like to take the floor and ask a question or make a comment yourself, in the chat, again, you can just say, I'd like to take the floor, and we will let you speak directly to our presenters and experts. The session will last altogether around an hour and a half. We're really looking forward to it, and really not to take too much time. I will just pass the word now to James. We will give him the presentation rights so that he can share his presentation. And we're off for the 4th day. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Lana, for that great introduction. And I'm just going to pull up my slides here. 1 second. As I'm pulling them up, I just want to say, first of all, a very big thank you for inviting me to present to this group here. It's quite exciting, not only to be able to talk, obviously, to a bunch of policymakers and then people very interested in policy, but also the presenters after me. I think it's a very interesting presentation. I'm quite excited to see what's going on in the world of STEM and BI. So on a very personal level as well, I'm actually quite excited for the next presentation too. But as the introduction, as Lana correctly introduced me, so my name is James Drummond. I'm a policy analyst in the Public Governance Directorate, specializing in regulatory policy in my day job, but with my behavioral insights work, it definitely crosses far outside of regulatory policy. And so I'm here today to present to you guys on our toolkit, what we call tools and ethics for applied behavioral insights, the BASIC Toolkit. But I'll also give a bit of a brief background on BI as well. And for those who, sorry, 1 second here. There we go. For those who don't know the OECD that well.
James, can I just interrupt you? There is a comment. If you could just slow down a little bit.
Sure, okay. Sorry about that.
The excitement is great. We appreciate the energy and the excitement, but thank you so much.
Apologies for that, and thanks for reminding me. Sometimes I do, speed on. So just as a bit of a reminder for those who don't know the OECD necessarily that well, one of the benefits of our work is that we develop it under what we call the committee system, which is a group of policymakers from the different policy communities of the OECD, senior decision makers who come together and we develop our work with. And so this is just a quick slide to note that the work on behavioral insights has been developed both from the academic point of view, our work with a bunch of academic institutions, as well as directly with governments around the world through the Regulatory Policy Committee and the Network of Economic Regulators. And since working on this for the past about 7 or 8 years, we developed a fairly extensive body of work on behavioral insights that broadly is in 3 buckets. The first is the application to regulatory policy, which is, of course, our day jobs. Then, as I mentioned, we are much broader than that as well. We do host international conferences around the world. The last one at the bottom corner of that was in South Africa, as well as develop tools and support for the community. The one on the top right there is the case study publication that we released a couple of years ago that has over 110 case studies in it. And then the one that I'm going to speak today with you about is the toolkit itself, which we released last year. So as a bit of an agenda of what I'll talk about, first I'll go through a bit of a BI 101, understanding that many people on this call might be a bit new to this or might need a bit of a refresher. Then I'll talk about the toolkit itself, and then I'll address some examples to get some thought process going. So starting off with what are behavioral insights. Normally what I would do here is do a very interactive exercise, but unfortunately because that we have to meet online because of the current state we're in, it's gonna be a bit more of a thought exercise that I'll walk you through. And the reason we would normally do this in an interactive way is that one of the messages we always try to give is behavior, and specifically the way that context and biases affect our behavior is present in all of us. And as you study this, from my point of view, you definitely see it in yourself constantly. But it's one of those things as policymakers, we need to be reminded constantly that these sort of interactions of behavior and context is in us all, and we need to keep them front in mind. So what I'm going to do is pose 4 situations that I normally would get you guys to stand up and then admit publicly that you fall victim to this, but we'll go through it as a bit of a thought exercise, and I'm sure you'll reflect and see yourself in these. So the first question, the first scenario is, have you ever had so much to do, you had an important appointment, and because of everything going on in your life, you've just missed the appointment, you were late to it? And I think all of us can reflect on this. I think we've all been there, and we often boil this down to a problem of attention. We have so many things going on in our lives, so many things that we need to pay attention to. It's really hard to pay attention to all of them at once. And sometimes we forget things even when they're really important. The next situation is, have you ever driven or been with a driver who has driven faster than the speed limit? Well, we often boil this down then to an issue with belief formation. The policy analyst who developed those road rules and those speed limits to follow probably did a very careful evaluation that speed limit is a good speed to go to both arrive efficiently to your destination as well as safely. But we have formed the belief that we're better drivers than that nice analysis has resulted in, and that we can go faster than the speed limit safely, that we formed that belief in ourselves. The third scenario is, have you ever been in a purchasing situation, seen so many options, chose something, and then regretted the choice that you made? Well, we say that there's a problem with choice. Our world around us, much like attention, is so complex, so difficult to make through all the different little choices that we need to make. Sometimes we're just overloaded, there's too much on our plate, and we can't make a good choice. A really classic example here, there's actually a cottage industry that has been created on using behavioral insights to make us purchase some things that we don't want, particularly in the restaurant industry. Have you ever went and purchased a cup of coffee and you see multiple different options, small, medium, large, extra large? Well, that's done deliberately to get you to buy a more expensive coffee, because research shows that if you're just given small and large, you'll choose small. But if you're given small, medium, and large, you'll choose medium. So immediately your choice is then to choose that middle option that's a bit more expensive than you meant to choose. And then finally, have you ever purchased a subscription to a gym, newspaper, magazine, anything, and failed to use it as much as you intended to? Well, I can definitely say I've done this before, and we often say that this is an issue with determination. That even if you make a good choice, sticking to that choice over time is exceptionally difficult, and that we require a whole different set of behavioral drivers to stick to our choices. So we call this the ABCD of behavioral insights. And it's a simple framework to try to start thinking of the way that, again, context and biases impact our way to make good decisions. And that as policymakers, we really need to be considering these aspects as we develop policy. So that's a bit of the thought exercise that makes you sort of think about your own situation, but a bit the more formulaic or technical definition of behavioral insights is that it's the lessons from behavioral and social sciences, such as psychology, decision-making, organizational and group behavior, that is applied to public policy making. So it's the specific public policy arm of this, that is behavioral insights. And what it uses is a robust methodology to use experiments and observation to gather information about how people actually behave and use that to drive decision-making. And really what this does is it uses what we call an inductive approach or a bottom-up approach. And why I mentioned that is that traditional public policy making is made based on a deductive model, where we all are educated in some field. I'm a political scientist by trade, but there's economists, lawyers, technical experts, education experts that are all involved in policy making. And our education background teaches us certain models, certain ways of looking at the world and at human behavior. And it's natural, based on our training, to apply those models. We approach a policy problem from those models' point of view. And those models are right a lot of the time, but not all the time. And oftentimes when a policy fails, it's because those models fail to consider something that is present in the real world that the model didn't consider. And what I posit to you today is that behavior and understanding behavior is one of those elements that is often forgotten in the deductive policymaking method, that taking this inductive bottom-up approach where we look at behaviors, understand behaviors, and use those understanding of behaviors to drive policy decisions helps build better policy. So a couple of sort of understanding of the way BI is around the world. So BI is the acronym for Behavioral Insights. This is a map that we put together about 3 years ago that we're currently updating. There's 202 institutions on that map that are applying behavioral insights. The color coding is simply that pink is those that are inside government. Green are those that are outside government but are helping government, such as research institutions or private sector. And then the blue are the multinationals, much like the OECD. Now, this map is definitely out of date. I can definitely tell you that we are updating this map, and the numbers are probably much closer to almost 400 at this point. So even the numbers that I'm showing you here are out of date, but it's just to show you that this is very much adopted around the world right now. And based on that 202 institutions, we did look a bit at the areas that they cover, and there's about 23 areas that are on this graph right now, and it shows you the relative importance here. Now, you'll notice that it's very small, but education is a bit on the low end. Now, this I would not say this means that there's not much out there with BI in education. It just means that it's still developing as a field, and I can definitely say that now that we've looked at hundreds of more institutions, that number is going to be much higher. But just to give you a bit of an idea of education placed on that. And in regards to how BI is used in policymaking, our evidence shows us that BI is mostly applied at the implementation phase of policy, often to policies that are not behaviorally informed, that haven't considered behavior to the point, but are trying to use it to tweak or improve the way that policy is implemented. We argue, and we're trying to push a lot, that actually the behavioral methodology, in its way that it can use and collect evidence, is really useful at the very early stage of policy, where you're trying to scope the problem, understand the problem, at the very end of policy, where you're trying to understand the policy problem from an ex post perspective, trying to understand what went wrong and develop a new policy making process on top of that. And we are producing some research right now that tries to understand and map and give incentives to use BI earlier and later in the policy cycle. So that's a bit of the BI 101 and how it's used, but now to get to the real meat of the presentation and why you guys asked me to present, which is how do you go about applying behavioral insights? So as I mentioned, last year we released the BASIC Toolkit, Tools and Ethics for Applied Behavioral Insights, the BASIC Toolkit. And BASIC is an acronym for the 5 stages that we say that you need to go through to apply behavioral insights to a policy problem. And this is starting with behavior, going to an analysis, then to strategies, intervention, and change. I'll come back to each one of these individually in a minute. Just a couple high-level remarks that we call this a process framework because it shows you the process for going through a behavioral project from start to finish. And it's really meant for policymakers. There are many ways BI is applied around the world right now. Outside of government, I mentioned marketing and getting us to buy expensive restaurant items. But this is really geared towards the policymaking process and the way policymakers work through an issue. It is built to be used in conjunction with the many other frameworks that are currently out there. There are a ton of BI frameworks out there. There, East and Mindspace are the 2 most famous. There's many more, Quadruple A, Test, Learn, Adapt. There are many of them out there. And most of these are what we call a prescriptive framework. It gives you a bit of a checklist. East stands for easy, attractive, social, and timely, where you can reflect on your project, you can reflect on your policy issue and say, have I made it easy? Have I made it social? But it doesn't teach you how to go about collecting the evidence to show that what you're trying to do works. And so ours is a process framework that definitely can incorporate those prescriptive frameworks in there. And I'll come back to that point because there's a specific time that I want to say. And that this framework was actually developed in extensive consultation with over 250 policymakers from 21 countries around the world. So again, to sort of hammer home the point that this was built for policymakers by policymakers, and we hope it's helpful to your process. So to give you a brief overview of what the package entails, there's actually 4 pieces to the toolkit. The first is a 1-page quick overview that's really meant for senior leaders when you're trying to pitch to a senior leader, to a politician, to a senior manager as to why BI is important. It's a quick 1-pager that you can just give them and say, here's why you need to consider behavior. Then we have a guidebook that's really meant for sort of the work stream manager, someone to understand the process writ large in about 20 pages, but not to get into the technical details. That's where the manual comes into play, where that's really the repository of technical pieces, where the analysts or the technical person working on the job needs to understand the different pieces. There's about 100+ pages on that sort of technical know-how. And then one of the unique pieces of this toolkit is that it's the first global ethical guidelines for applying BI responsibly. I'll mention this a few times in my presentation, but we are using psychology to inform policy, and we have to be very careful how we do it and do it responsibly. So those are the 4 pieces. You'll see in the top right corner, we have an all-in-one publication that contains all of that in one. It's very thick, it's very good. But we've also developed a behaviorally informed brochure that just contains the 1-page brief and the essential guidebook. That is an easy sort of piece to pick up and sort of understand the basic toolkit sort of in one shot. So to go through the individual stages very quickly. So behavior, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to identify and define the problem, particularly the behavioral problem from the non-behavioral problem. Every policy problem will have multiple drivers. It'll have structural, it'll have technical, legal, economic issues, but it'll also probably have behavioral issues in there. And so you definitely want to approach the behavioral issues from a behavioral point of view. So here, the first step is to try to understand those behaviors that's driving the policy issue. What are the behaviors that are at stake here? Then out of that world of behaviors that is a part of the policy issues, which behaviors should you even target? There's a number of political, economic, technical, legal, and otherwise reasons why some behaviors are not targetable and some are. Maybe you're trying to pitch in a very conservative government situation, a very liberal approach to this that you might not be able to do. So you might need to adjust which behaviors you can target given your climate. Then you want to understand your desired policy outcome. How do you want to leverage these behaviors and in what direction and for what outcome? And then try to understand the context in which these behaviors are operating so that you can also try to address those context issues as well. One of the things we try to say here is to manage expectations. So I put up a silver bullet for those who know the folklore. The silver bullet is the thing that kills all mythical creatures, and is a metaphor for that sort of simple solution to all complex problems. While behavior, as I keep on saying, is an important forgotten element of policy, it's not going to solve all policy issues right away. It's to be used in conjunction with a holistic approach, but do manage expectation that it's not going to solve your problem likely right off the bat. The next stage after you understand the behaviors is to analyze those behaviors. I won't go through the slide because we just did it a couple minutes ago with the ABCD framework, but let's try to understand where your behavior lies on the ABCD framework. And this is where I mentioned all the other frameworks that are out there could be easily substituted for ABCD and used just as well. Then I've little shrunk the image there because it's going to matter here, that the next stage is once you understand where that behavior lies, is to start developing strategies for changing this behavior. And I put a little asterisk there that says, with the support of behavioral experts, because many of us that want to approach behavioral insights don't come from a psychology background necessarily. And we do want to make sure that we are incorporating proper psychological experts in these experiments, again, because we want to make sure we're doing it correctly. So a couple of quick examples here for attention. Several countries have experimented with SMS or text messaging reminders. In the UK, when they did this in the National Health Service, for the National Hospital Service, they actually reduced the number of missed appointments by 25% by sending a text message reminder. For belief formation in the United States, they painted horizontal white lines on the road that gave the image or the pattern that you're going faster than you are, and that reduced crashes by 36%. For choice, we often suggest highlighting or making very visible the choice that you want people to make, and that will help cut through all of the additional noise that is making it difficult to make a good decision. Many countries have experimented with this with utility bills and making very, very salient what information is important, particularly the usage of your utilities, usage of energy, usage of water, trying to draw people's attention that they're using too much energy or too much water. And then finally, for determination, a very classic tool here is to use a planning tool, or what we call an implementation intention tool, where you get people to actually say, here is the schedule, here's the plan at which I will accomplish this task with dates, and that helps them focus and stay on track. They did this in the UK for job seekers, people who are out of employment but looking for a job, and people found 23% more jobs using just a planning method to help keep on track to finding their jobs. Then once you've developed a strategy for what you're going to do, you use a text message, you're going to use a planning tool. The next step is to test it, make sure it works. This is a graduate level course on its own, so I won't even attempt to explain testing and interventions fully, but the very simple explanation is that the gold standard, what we say is the best way, is the RCT, or randomized controlled trial. And a very simplified version of this is you take a sample of people, randomize them into treatment and control, give the treatment the intervention that you want to test, don't give it to the control, and examine what is the difference between the two groups to see if it worked or not. Often in government settings, this is a very difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of planning. There are a number of alternatives to randomized controlled trial that governments around the world use, including surveys, questionnaires, lab experiments, field experiments, a number of different statistical tools to try to analyze the data. So just to say that while RCT is the gold standard, it is not the only standard, and there's many ways to apply to test a behavioral insight. And then the final stage, according to the BASIC Toolkit, is to implement, is to scale up what worked into a policy decision, excuse me. A couple of key considerations here is, this is a complicated way of this first point of saying that times might have changed since you started your intervention, and maybe the political situation has changed, maybe the project has changed, maybe the policy goal has changed, and it's possible that the results might not longer fit as well as you want, or the results might give a call to government to do something much broader and much bigger here, that there's a huge behavioral issue here, and we need to go back and do a bit more research. So it's always important to take that minute to look back and make sure that you're still on message. The next would be to implement and scale up what worked, very, very simply. Third, again, coming back to this concept of using psychology in policymaking, that you do want to set up mechanisms for monitoring and evaluating the long-term and potential side effects, making sure that there's not an unintended consequence, that people are potentially suffering an ill effect from this. The fourth point, maintain the policy initiative, is just simply to say, if you tested SMS reminders in hospitals, it doesn't mean that SMS reminders work for every policy problem, and that suddenly government should just be sending out SMS reminders for everything. And in fact, that's actually the worst approach to take, because then you would be flooding people with SMS reminders, and the whole point of an SMS would be to cut through issues of attention. And now you're sending everyone an SMS and making their lives very complicated, and they can no longer decide what is best to do. So make sure you keep focused on what you tested and not extrapolate those findings further than what they were meant to mean. And then finally, write up and tell people what you did, whether positive or negative. It's important that we learn what worked and what didn't, so that other policymakers around the world can learn from you. So that, in a nutshell, is the basic process. I mentioned that there was ethical guidelines involved. This, again, is very in-depth, so I'm just going to cover it at a very high level. We include general guidelines. Broadly, these are that you need to always evaluate the ethics of your intervention and carefully consider consent and awareness. Again, using psychology on people, you'd want to be transparent and open and make sure that they understand what you are doing. Before beginning an intervention, make sure that you have structures in place, that you are having ethical review, and that you're having the ethical supervision of data, including its collection, usage, and storage. And then this is one I definitely won't go into, because we have specific guidelines by each of the 5 stages. There's actually over 50 guidelines in there, so I encourage you to go take a look at the report. So that is a broad overview of what you would find in BASIC. And in my last few minutes here, I'll give a couple of quick examples of how it's used around the world. My colleagues from proMENTE will be talking about it in an education context, so I won't scoop them. So I'll give you a couple of interesting examples that are easy to explain and might give you some thinking as to maybe how these could apply in the education context. The first is a very famous example from the UK. And this is using what we call social norms. And social norms is a very powerful behavioral insight, one of the ones that works very often and very strongly. And what we mean by social norms is that humans are social animals. We like to be part of a group. We like to be part of a collection of others. And when we realize that we're not part of a group, we work very hard to get back into the group. And so what social norm approach will do is try to show people that you're not acting with others and that you want to be acting with others. So here, this was an issue of antimicrobial resistance. There was an overprescription of antibiotics. The number of bad microbes out there were going up. And this is partly due to general practitioners, GPs, overprescribing antibiotics. So what they did was they used a social norm approach. I won't go into the details of the intervention, but they separated doctors who were of the highest prescription rates, the top 20%. So they took all the doctors and they made the top 20% of prescribers, and they sent them a letter saying that you are amongst the top 20% of prescribers of antibiotics in your local area. And they also included some information as to how to reduce the number of prescriptions. Just sending that letter and telling them that they're amongst the top reduced the number of prescriptions by over 3%, which was over 70,000 prescriptions of antibiotics. No other information was given, just that. So they're quite powerful. The next example is another one of these mobile-based examples, and this comes from my home country of Canada, where there they were, suffering from an obesity epidemic, where a third of youth and over 60% of adults were classified as obese. And one thing in Canada that's very specific to us is that we use a lot of loyalty points. Pretty much every major store offers these cards where if you purchase things with them, you can gain points to then use for rewards later on. So what the Canadian government did was build an app that said, okay, do a bunch of health quizzes, healthy eating choice quizzes, log your physical activity, connect this with your Fitbit, and you can earn more loyalty points. You can get more stuff out of this. As a result, after just 12 weeks, overall users were walking 5% more, but amongst the least active, they were walking more than 20% more. So again, just using that sort of the app, which is very, very handy, but also motivating non-monetary incentives, using these loyalty points, motivated people to get off the couch and walk more. And then finally, this is from an experiment that we actually just finished. This is again, I won't go into the details because it's regulatory policy and it's a bit boring, but the point is, this is a letter sent out when someone has not conformed with the safety regulation, when they have made an error in the government saying, you've made an error, fix your choice. This letter is really undynamic. I mean, someone's just done something bad. They violated safety policy. They don't even list them by name. They just say, dear registered gas installer. They don't highlight what is the issue. It looks like a standard letter that you might get 10, 15, 20 letters a day. This looks like any other letter you would get. What makes me want to pay attention to this out of any other letter? It's very legal, a lot of legal text in there. It's very just tough to know what to do with this letter. So we actually worked with them to change the letter. We made, the classic red means stop. You have done something wrong. You have committed a no-no, and that you need to pay attention to this letter for a minute. We've also personalized it. You'll see a fake name, Dear James Joyce. We have highlighted the important text in there that they need to remedy these situations according to certain guidelines. But then, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we included this implementation intention, this area where the recipient can actually chart down what they plan to do and according to what timeline to remedy the error that they've made. We sent this to gas installers, the people who connect the gas at your house, and those that were located in firms, in businesses, responded that they were 13 percentage points more likely to resolve the situation based on receiving this letter. There's an important message here, and it's to understand the groups that you're dealing with. Because when we sent this to individuals who work alone, who don't work in firms, they're actually the opposite, the mirror, 14 percentage points less likely to respond to this letter. So this is where, again, blanket policy solutions don't always work and need to understand each individual behavior. So my very last slide is sort of to sum all this up. The key takeaways is that really need to be choosing the right tool for the job. Behavioral Insights offers a powerful tool to help policymakers improve outcomes in a holistic approach with all the other ways to approach policy. As I just mentioned, location and time and context matters. What works in one situation doesn't always work in another, and you need to be testing and understanding that. And that, again, coming back to this message of BI is not a silver bullet. It will help definitely improve policy, but it needs to be part of a holistic approach. So that's it for my presentation. If you want to know more about our work, you can visit oe.cd/nudge, send me an email, or get in touch with me on social media. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope I spoke a bit slower for you there during the presentation.
Thank you very much, James. Excellent introduction to the whole thing, and I think we now definitely all understand a little bit more about what it is. Before we go to questions, and there are already some in the comments, I will give now the word to our colleagues from proMENTE, Ivona and Lamia, who will present how they used the methodology actually in their recent work. And then we'll go to the questions. So Ivona, Lamia, you are now the presenters, and you can take over. Thank you.
Okay, now we will explain behavioral insight approach in examining gender differences in STEM field. The study conducted by UN Women and proMENTE Social Research. And the aim of the study is to examine the interests of students in the STEM area and to identify the barriers that women face in the STEM. Next, in the first phase, behavior, we focused on defining the problem. Within our study, the first phase involved the analysis of available statistics on the representation of women in STEM area, and based on the review of data, insufficient representation of women in the STEM area was found. So in the second phase, behavioral analysis, involved the identification of psychological, cognitive, and contextual factors that affect the target behavior. For example, insufficient engagement of girls and women in STEM. In this regard, the basis for the methodological design used in our research are theories that explain the barriers that women face in an area traditionally dominated by men. Next stages, for example, identifying strategies and change, we will explain later. You can go next, Ivona. The theoretical framework on which the methodological design is based primarily includes the influence of socialization processes on the formation of children's attitudes about social roles, competencies, educational and career opportunities. The patriarchal model of family and social relations, according to which a woman is naturally predisposed to take care of the household and a man to take care of finances, has been transferred to the field of education and work. These biological differences between men and women have resulted in the emergence of social differences and differences between male and female occupations. It is assumed that children internalize stereotypical messages about the distribution of roles and messages about the classification of occupations according to gender. Consequently, women are more focused on the community, helping profession, and men on occupations that provide financial well-being and status. These stereotypes can be present on a conscious and unconscious level. You can go next.
But I can't.
Oh, back. Next slide. So different life experiences that are a product of process of socialization can lead to development of different cognitive abilities and the investment of cognitive resources in different domains. So the girls focus on developing verbal skills and building interpersonal relationship. On the other hand, boys are focused on problem solving. Consequently, educational and career preferences may be the result of differences in certain cognitive abilities. For example, men achieve higher scores on measures of spatial abilities compared to women, and successful performance on these tests in childhood predicts future performance in STEM field. So differences in abilities and socialization processes affect career orientation. In order to explain the differences in career orientation, we also looked at the model Lubinsky and Bamble. According to this model, competence in performing a particular job and the sense of satisfaction that the job provides are the main criteria for adapting to the work environment. So Also, individuals will pursue their career interests when their needs are met and when the environment encourages them appropriately. For example, providing support, challenges, opportunities for professional growth and development. Studies show that women through the socialization process do not have enough support to engage in the STEM field. And also studies show that women feel that they are not competent enough to deal with STEM. So that perceived self-efficacy or beliefs in our own abilities and competencies influence decision-making. Accordingly, women tend to leave the STEM area due to low perceived self-efficacy and insufficient support from society. So Ivona will explain the next model.
So, Lamia, can I ask you to do this model also, because I prepare next slides.
Of course. Eccles' model of expectation and values, according to this model, career choices are the results of a combination of expectation of success and the subjective value of a particular career domain. So low self-efficacy in women when it comes to the STEM area leads to them valuing the STEM area less and not expecting success in the STEM area. So this affects the orientation of women toward other career paths. The lack of motivation of girls to pursue the STEM field can be explained also by Eisen and Fishbein model. According to this model, social pressures influence the subjective norms or beliefs of girls and women that society does not approve their involvement in career domains dominated by men. As a result, girls and women develop negative attitudes towards STEM and a reduced sense of belonging to that career area. You can go next one. Mine's.
So ultimately, even when involved, women are more likely to leave the STEM area more than men. One of the reasons is this organizational climate and culture. So cultural success in STEM is associated with men often leading women to feel they do not belong in this field. And also organizational culture supports stereotypes in a way that men are more often presented as a programmer, hacker, engineering. So our research has shown that women who achieve success in traditionally masculine area face punishment from society. For example, like attributing negative traits. The tool we creating. So all these things we present you in these first slides are things we use as a base for working on and creating tools. Of course, we didn't create all tools what we use in our research, but we use some which is existing already, but we need to work on them to be put in the context of our country. So the tools created we need for our research included all these described factor what we did before. Our study was conducting on a sample of primary students, primary school students, who we call secondary or high school students, and students of social science, humanities, and STEM field. In this way, it was possible to identify vertical development period in which they are different in interest in STEM area and when they regarded to gender. So also study was conducting on a sample of teachers actually teaching stuff in all of these vertical schools what we mentioned before, and we're trying to examine gender stereotypes and the role of teaching staff in defining the educational and career goals of students. So the obtained results is what we actually hadn't expect. They like these tested theoretical frameworks, what we mentioned before, especially in the IT sector. So in accordance with the obtained result, we approach to the next step of behavior insight approach, which is intervention. So strategy, intervention. What we did, we proposed some intervention, depends of course of level and depends of results of our research. So these interventions are aimed, for example, some of interventions are aimed increasing interest in computer science, intervention aimed to reduce stereotypes, some different role plays or some different play things for children in primary school. And I will connect now with this one intervention which James shared with us, carrot rewards, something like that. Then intervention aimed at strengthening self-awareness in the IT sector, intervention that includes sending social normative message through designing, educational, and entertainment content. So this is something where is one step as you see in James' presentation. So next steps is after detailed design of concept of intervention programs, we need to implement them. So the implementation and verification of effectiveness of intervention follows. We are not go. We didn't go there. We expect from UN Women that they will use all our proposed intervention, or some of them, or something. Probably they will do it in accordance with proMENTE and with our research team on this project and on this study. But as James said, if interventions are effective in achieving goal, the next step is the behavioral insight approach is to inform education policy makers. Why we think that this approach is good? So this approach can be very effective in achieving goals. Firstly, and mainly because the identification of behavior and adequate strategy for solving everything what we have as a product of this research is actually evidence-based. What does that mean? It means that we have exactly in some area of, in this case, Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have in this school, in this concept, we have this results. According to this result, we will do this intervention. According to this intervention, we will try to set up goals, and we will see is it work or not. If it is work, then we inform policymakers. So we have evidence, and we can go with good argument for the policymakers. So potential educational policies may include the revision of curricula, or yes, this is what we can actually do. Also, people pay less attention for explicit message, like we see in James examples, or what else we can do. So policymakers can actually focus more on the things what can be done regarding our research group, if I can say, or the beneficiaries we choose regarding this achieving goal. So educational policies can include raising awareness of parents, raising awareness of teachers, raising awareness of peers, girls, boys. What is interesting in our research is that actually we don't need to learn girls. We don't need to work with, we need, but not put the extreme focus on them. We need to work with boys. So because of the result of the boys are more fulfilled of prejudice and stereotypes than it is in girls. So in the end, we believe that this great advantage of behavior insight approach is that all solution to problem through intervention and later through policies and everything what can be done after this kind of research is empirical evidence and consideration all, as we see again in James' presentation, psychological, cognitive, and contextual determination of behavior. Thank you. That's all from us.
Thank you very much, Ivona and Lamia. There were a few questions. Yes, thank you so much. I think it's very important that we try to see an example in education sector and how this works. Here, as far as I understand, maybe our main prejudice as educators was that we need to work on self-confidence of girls and we need to work with girls, but here it seems that actually our target group is boys. Of course, there are other questions that I will then go through and try to moderate this. And yes, for everybody, please go ahead and post your questions in comments or ask for the floor in the comment sections. So thank you, James, for a very interesting presentation. I'm going straight into the first question. You mentioned that BI can be used to push us towards behaviors that can harm us. Examples: bigger cup of coffee, more money out of our pocket, more caffeine in our body. How can we make sure that BI is used for ethical purposes? Are the ethical guidelines and procedures enough? And actually, this is a question. So is this only for the market seems to be using it actually in the wrong way? So James, if you can comment on this.
Thank you. It's a very good question, and it's a very complicated question. And I think you've hit right on a very important point. Well, there's sort of a couple of ways I would answer. One is, I mean, one of the criticisms Behavioral Insights has received is that it's nothing new, which is true. People have been studying psychology and human decision making for decades. I have two psychologists on the line from proMENTE. I think you can confirm that the research that you're building upon is quite old. So the understanding of behavior and using it to drive decision making has been used for a long time, but it's been mostly used by the private sector, again, to get us to do things that we might not necessarily want to do. So I think, and in regards to what is new about it, is the actual behavioral insights, the application to policy. Governments using this to counter and to sort of oppose the forces that are out there trying to get us to drink more caffeine, more sugar, whatever it might be. So I think the first step there in regards to your question is to sort of align behavioral insights with the traditional goals of government, which is to try to level the playing field, try to create a market, try to create a society where the imperfections are ironed out, where the detriments to society are being addressed. One of the traditional ways government decides this, going back to what I said about the deductive approach, is they often use a model such as the economic rational actor model, where they say, okay, well, is there a problem with not enough information? Well, we'll give them more information. Is there a problem with externalities? People are being polluted or healthcare systems are being overrun. Is there what's called a principal agent problem? These sort of traditional economic-y approaches. And what I always argue is that behavioral insights offers a new way for government to justify intervention, a new way to say there's a failure, there's a problem here, and that government is justified in addressing it. And the failure is often that the private sector is using these exact tools to get us to do something, to buy more coffee, to spend more money than we would normally want to spend. These sorts of things, maybe not accessing education systems, not learning to our optimum ideal. These are goals that government was created to do, and that is an ethical use of BI. But then you start getting into the more marginal applications of, is it right to do this or that? And there I have no really good answer for you, other than the guidelines we've included are an attempt to guide people. They're not rules. We can't tell people this is the one and only way to approach everything anywhere in the world. But working with researchers who are under very, very strong ethical guidelines often, working within codes of conduct, working in teams that are focused on doing good, are often, counterbalances against the one application in the wrong way. That doesn't mean that it's not been used for bad. I'm sure it has, but luckily the community has been really good so far in the last decade or so, has been applying it very, very responsibly. But you are correct to sort of point out that one ethical issue. How that's answered your question.
Thank you very much, James. So what you're trying to say is that policymakers, if I can kind of give my understanding of this, that policymakers should take behavior, let's say, take over the behavior that market is using, and using kind of the same tools for good rather than for selling things and getting more money. There's another question here from Sandra. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Here's my question. You have a comprehensive view regarding using nudging as a policy instrument in OECD countries. Could you reflect what are the countries that use nudging in education policy the most? And is the using of nudging more common in pre-primary, basic, secondary, or higher education level? So from your examples, James, from your map, is there anything there?
Maybe I'll defer to my proMENTE colleagues to maybe they might have a better read on this than me, because as I sort of mentioned at the start, I'm not an expert in education. I'm very interested in education, and in my actual academic work, I've looked at education policy a lot, but not often from a behavioral point of view. So unfortunately don't have a strong answer, especially in regards to numbers or relative scales. I can definitely say there's many governments. I know that Australia is using it, Canada's using it. I have colleagues in the Western Cape government, which is a provincial government in South Africa, who are using it very, very heavily. And there's in our case study publication, there's a couple interesting examples there where they use behavioral insights in regards to trying to improve the number of at-risk youth going to these after-school education centers that they established. I didn't include it because it's a very complicated example to explain, and in the context of this, it was going to be too difficult to explain. But there is that example in that publication, which I can send around a copy of, no problem. A related example, but it's not quite education, but it's related. They did a very interesting experiment with getting youth to use a mobile app to plan their weekend activities. And the idea there was that when youth don't have plans, they go to bad areas of town and they get involved in bad activities and often get hurt and often are subject to violence. And by pre-planning their activities, using social norms as well to broadcast it, tell everyone what they're going to do, they actually reduce the number of youth getting into violent situations on the weekends and after school. So while this is not school related, it is the population that you're talking about. I don't know the strong examples from other areas. I know I was reading there was New South Wales, which is a provincial government in Australia, is using behavioral insights to try to get teachers to go to underserviced areas, rural areas. So I would say that it's really being used across the board. Many countries are developing it, but the exact numbers and all the exact examples are a bit outside of my subject area. So I hope my proMENTE colleagues can maybe jump in and answer.
Lana, can I say something?
Yes, please go ahead, Lamia.
Firstly, I would like to refer the first question about growth mindset for other participants. There is Not in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There's no examples for improving growth mindset in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but there are certain examples in the world where teachers have encouraged growth mindset. For example, in one quasi-experimental design, teachers encouraged children to view intelligence as a changing attribute, and when they learn in the content, they emphasize that success is the result of effort, not innate abilities. So an experimental group of students was exposed to this approach. The control group was not exposed to this treatment. At the end of the school semester, students did maths or physics tests, and experimental group achieved better results. For next questions about what country are the countries that use nudging in educational policy the most, I really don't know in the world, but in Balkan, none.
Yeah, because this is the first behavioral side
approach in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I think in Balkan also.
Even though we just came to the third step, we finished third step, so we will see how it will going on. We are in the half of full way, halfway.
Can I just ask something? Go ahead, James.
Sorry, if you want to go.
I was just now I've lost my. No, it's okay. What I wanted to ask Ivona or Lamia, can give us a specific example of what they suggested as an implementation. Like you had several levels of what things you wanted to change and things, but can you give us a particular example? Is it about mobile phone application? So are you already in your research far enough to tell us what are your recommendations? Go ahead, Ivona, please.
Lavia, please, if I miss something, just add it.
Of course.
It's a couple of intervention, which is actually maybe we should after I don't know how many times we're there, UN Women present their own result, then we can present, but I will count something which is providing positive emotional experience related for the computer science, enable the experience of competencies in the field of computer science, which is in line with the need of each person to act effectively. For example, what are the tasks with the educational workshop should be optimal difficulty, the basic condition for experiencing competencies in the optimal difficulty in the task, providing positive information to the work in order to strengthen self-efficiency. The girls will have the opportunity to choose thematic units to be covered in line with the human need to act automatically. Girls will encourage to work independently, team to strengthening the collaborative atmosphere, work leaders to successful female STEM role models. So learning how to learn, thinking how to learn from mistakes made when designing simple video games. What else? I prepare some lists for this. Just a second. Some more interventions is designing simple video games enable authentic acquisition of knowledge because it gives children the opportunity to personalize avatars and the environment in video games. Personalization and contextualization affect instinctive motivation and learning outcomes. The acquired skills are also applicable in everyday life, and intervention aim to reduce stereotypes that called jigsaw classroom. Probably James know more about this. So and some special activities. Students can be divided into several groups. Members of each groups are both boys and girls. Lessons from STEM are shared with each member of the group. Students should solve tasks or realize a mini project based on the acquired knowledge. The member of the group work together to master and present the material, work together to foster sense of belonging, role plays. Participants should be encouraged to take role plays that are contrary to the natural rules. By imitation dances in the role, participants can better understand the other side. What else? That's some of maybe most interesting, but all of them have their own steps in activities. I just took some of it possible, and it can be applied in different area of Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the different age of students. And of course, I didn't mention now, but we have some intervention for parents, teachers, and other public.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, if you have something, please add it.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Thank you very much. There's two more questions. One is if James could share a little bit more about this information on teacher who are going to undeserved areas. I guess that was from Australia example. And if any of you know any examples of how this was used for low SES students.
I'll definitely find the link and send it around. I'll also send around this case study publication that I keep mentioning. All of the South African examples, I think there is 4 or 5 from South Africa. Only one is specifically on after schools, after school programs. Everything else is on youth. But that said, they're all on disadvantaged youth. That's the specific problem that South Africa is trying to use BI to address, and that's their entire focus. So I would suggest reading those case studies, and I can definitely try to dig up more information on what they're doing, for example.
Just 1 second. Also examples that address polarization in the society. For example, Bucho says, e.g. Syrian and Turkish community, which have a huge effect on education rights as well. Anything on that?
I actually have a close friend who's doing his PhD at Columbia University right now. And I believe his entire focus is on that region of the world and education programs there. So if you want, what I can do is I can try to go ask him for some of these examples, because I think he's doing work exactly in this area.
Okay, I mean, thank you very much. We can definitely use any kind of extra input that any of you can provide for us. Yeah, it's what is interesting is that it seems that it has been used a lot in health. And it seems that whenever we look at policy from education point of view, we see how health is doing some really good things that we don't manage to do, and they move the policy so much quicker than education does. And maybe this is an approach that we should take more in order to move this. There is another question. Do you think this is the toolkit for interconnected policy areas? If so, how do you overcome difficulties caused by this? So I guess when we're talking about different areas, maybe health and education or anything like that.
Thank you for that. That's very good questions. That's also a complicated one. We haven't tested it in that situation, but I would say that it definitely can be used. What the toolkit tries to do is give you the process that if you theoretically follow the process soundly, you should arrive at a good behaviorally informed policy situation. And I would say the complicated part will probably be in that first stage behavior and probably the analysis phase as well, where breaking the policy problem down into each of its constituent parts, the structural, the standard policy parts, the behavioral parts, it'll probably be a lot of crossing of wires in there. So, and maybe many different, I could see a situation where addressing one behavior might positively affect, but might in one case negatively affect in another, just given that these are different areas. And behavior is absolutely context dependent. So an education context is different than a health context. Missing an appointment with a principal is very different than missing an appointment at your local hospital. And so I think the very difficult thing to do is going to be to tease out those different behaviors in each of the situations, how they interact with each other, and how addressing one will affect another, and is there any kind of crossovers. I think that is somewhere, when you approach this from an interconnected or interdisciplinary point of view, you're going to have to spend an extra large amount of time on that early stage. And that's something I didn't mention in general. Thinking about the weighting of the time that you spend doing this, we kind of say it's the 80-20 rule. 80% of your time upfront, scoping, understanding the problem. The intervention takes care of itself once you understand things. But really spending your time upfront understanding the issue and analyzing the issue is hyper important in a normal situation. And I would say in an interconnected, interdisciplinary situation, that becomes even more of an important point, that spending that time upfront, making sure you understand.
Okay, a question for Imona and Lamia, two questions actually. On one hand, my question is, when I look at the process of your research, it doesn't seem very much different to what we would usually do. I mean, we look at previous research, we look at what policies we have, we look at good practice examples. So do you find in that part, in the actual research process, something that is very different when you do behavioral insight? And the other question is about whether you've seen this type of research on STEM and girls and education somewhere else in the world. So in the Balkans, we heard it was not used, but for this particular area of STEM in education, do you know? Go ahead, please.
Okay, this first part where you're looking for this research, preparation, and all that stuff, yes, that's almost the same.
But the key difference is interventions and improving interventions, and other part of research when in future we will use the control and experimental group to examining which strategies is effective on to solve this problem.
But even though it is very similar, they're usually research, especially if we have this experimental or quasi-experimental design or models of research. So it is pretty similar. So we don't need to be scared that it's rocket science. No, but this intervention and counting intervention, preparation, how and where intervention need to be applied, for whom, in which way, that is the maybe most important part of this behavior insight approach. James, correct me if I'm wrong. And then you have research again after intervention, after some time and implementing of this of some intervention, then you have this quasi-experimental or experimental approach, actually methodology of research to see does it work or not.
If I can jump in there, I couldn't agree more. I think that's a very, very good comment. I've been focusing on sort of the process, so it sounds very hyper technical. Though definitely, even from our own experience, you sometimes need to approach the problem from a very technical point of view, sometimes need to approach it from a very much a thought point of view. I'll give you an example. Actually, we just completed work, as I mentioned, on safety culture. I showed the last example was from that. Work has not been done on behavioral insights and safety culture on oil platforms, pretty much non-existent. So we don't have a large body of research to dive into randomized controlled trials in safety on oil rigs. It just doesn't exist. So what we did was we did very much a kind of more qualitative approach to it, where we use the BASIC process as a thought process, as something to guide our thinking. Did use a behaviorally informed survey exercise to sort of test some behavioral insights. And the lesson that comes out of that, that's a really good way to quickly scope and try to understand the field that you're working in. And then from there, you can use those findings to go deeper and deeper and more robust, more strong. So I as much as I'm talking about the process, I want to say that's a very good comment from Ivona, and I wholeheartedly agree that sometimes and often you need to take a step back and do just the more mental thinking more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Do you have an answer about using STEM BI for STEM and girls in somewhere else in the world in education? If you don't, it's fine. I'm just wondering if it has been used.
Even though we did this really very huge desk research regarding, we didn't actually find it.
You didn't find it. Okay. There's a question from Sandra to James regarding the policy cycle. You mentioned that BI is usually used in policy implementation phase, but OECD is more and more encouraging countries to use it in earlier phase of policy cycle, if I understood correctly. Could you bring some examples of how the BI have been used in earlier phases of policy cycle?
You're about 6 months ahead of me right now. We're currently developing papers on this, and I don't, and not that I don't want to say anything about it, I just don't have it. Stay tuned. Towards the end of this year, we'll be releasing papers on this. The things I can say that, because we're at the very early stages of developing the work, is that much off of Ivona's comments just a minute ago, the way you use behavioral insights around the policymaking cycle will change. When you're in the design phase of a policy, you probably don't have the time, the knowledge, the ability to run a randomized controlled trial on different design options. Probably don't, your minister is probably breathing down your neck saying, I need an answer, give me an answer. It's probably a more theoretical or qualitative application of BI where you do a bit of desk research and try to understand the issue. Whereas when you're looking at it from an evaluative point of view, from an ex post, that's when you probably don't have anyone pushing you hard for an answer. You have some time, and that's probably where running randomized controlled trials and spending a lot more time going through the process matters. I do know on that last point that the Netherlands is doing this. And I'm asking my colleague for an example from it, so I can't talk about it because he hasn't given me the example yet, but I know that the Netherlands is using BI from an ex post, from an evaluation perspective. But it's a really good question, and I really look forward to sharing the paper with you when it's ready.
Okay, so we'll have to be patient and wait a little bit longer to hear that answer, but thank you very much for that question and for the response. Let's see, is there, before we close, I mean, we were quite efficient with questions and everything. Just let's see if there is somebody still maybe thinking of asking a question. I see that for us, very importantly, we see that BI has been now in the lingo, and we can't discover at NEPS whether it's because first time we heard it in our network is when we did the net mapping of what our members are doing, and we heard from proMENTE that they are working on this. And now I see it everywhere. So I don't know if it's the question of being aware of it and then seeing it, and it's something to do with psychology, I'm sure, or if there's just more of it around us. I think that audience has no more question for you. So
can I just can I do one thing? Sorry, this
if
is
you want closing words. Go ahead.
No, I don't want that. It's more of a word of encouragement to say, I'm really encouraged. Again, has been pointed out, education is lacking. I think a bit in this field, and I wanted to say that I think it's natural. If you look at where behavioral insights came from, the crossover from academia to policy came when Richard Thaler, one of the authors of Nudge, and just won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. He's a behavioral economist, so he looks at the economic application of this. And it's when he helped establish the UK unit, UK Behavioral Insights team. And this was in the wake of the financial crisis, where it was a financial meltdown that led to a worldwide recession. So it was a behavioral economist addressing a crisis situation of economic and financial importance. And I won't put it up, but if you look at the graph I put up, you look at most of the applications, they're in the economics and the financial fields. And that's natural because that's where a lot of this research has come from and where the crossover happened to policy. I think a lot of these social fields are catching up. Health, education, social impacts, women, gender. these areas are currently catching up, and it's the wicked problems that this world is facing is in these areas. And I'm really encouraged that proMENTE and that your network is interested in this. It really is the next frontier, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of it. So it's more
Okay.
that.
Thank you.
While you were trying to close, of course, there was another question coming in. Our most active summer school student, Burcu, has another question for you. How do you make intervention effects sustainable? Does the results continue forever? Or, it's also about, I guess, human behavior, or once we get used to these SMS messages, we no longer react to them. So does it need to be like revamped every so often?
I talk too much, but does proMENTE want to talk first?
Go ahead, James. We'll give them the word as well. Just go ahead. Okay.
Very good question. There is lots of evidence out there that behavioral effects do die off over time. Not always, but often. People do get used to them. People, become aware of them. They learn to counter them. Behavior is a very tough thing to change. And it is something, and it kind of goes back to my change slide. I think monitoring effects over time, not just for unintended effects, but also just the way the policy is working, is very important. And I think it's also a bit natural, because not only do people become aware, but then when they start changing their behavior, then the outcomes will be different, and there'll be different behaviors that come into play. So it is a cycle. It is an iterative cycle that you need to go through and need to be watching and understanding.
Ivana or Lamia, I'm sorry.
Lamia, do you want maybe to say something before or after me, whatever?
I totally agree with James, and in our case, we will see.
We will see, actually, yes, but it is true that behavior is changeable. And probably after some time, after new generations, after all that stuff, you always need for new behavior change.
Because behavior is changeable.
Yes, so that's why, yes, it is sustainable, maybe for that generation, Burcu, maybe for in some area less, in some area more. But yes, we always will done new intervention in some area, and especially when we're talking about this STEM or gender equality. So we know how sustainable it is. We'll see.
Okay.
Our intervention and policy will be based on these results, not on facts.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Ivana, Lamia, James. It was a very insightful and interesting session for us, something to make us think, nudge our brain a little bit. And I really wish you a good rest of the day, and I hope that we will continue to discuss these topics and hopefully work with BI further. James, please feel free whenever you have something new to send us an email and share with us what you have. Of course, we'll be watching for online things as well. Again, thank you so much, everybody. Good session. And for the last session, we see you tomorrow for those who will join us on Students' Voice. Okay, goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, bye, bye.
Thank you, Lana. Thank you, Nem. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Lamia, Lana. Thank you.
Ciao.